Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, recorded prior to the appointment of Theresa May as Prime Minister, I spoke with Mr. Keir Martland about the Brexit referendum and the potential fallout from it. Mr. Martland is the Director of Publications at the Libertarian Alliance and the host of the Free Life podcast. He is the author of Liberty from a Beginner Selected Essays. You can follow his work at keirmartland.co.uk. That's keirmartland.co.uk and at thelibertarianalliance.com. You can find him on Twitter at KeirJMartland. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brexit. So I think most people have some sense of what the Brexit referendum is, but just to bring everybody up to speed in case they don't, can you give an overview of what the Brexit referendum was?
Sure. The first thing I think we have to get out of the way, because it would really set the scene for the whole of the episode, is that this referendum is merely consultative or advisory. And so the politicians in Britain decided to consult the public in a referendum on this issue of whether or not Britain should leave or remain in the European Union. And the result was something like 52% to leave and 48% to remain. And so it seems that British politics will be more or less defined by this one referendum for the coming years. But there are issues surrounding this. Mainly whether the politicians will actually go through with it, because this isn't a binding referendum, as I understand you have in America, where in your state legislatures, if your state legislature wants to increase taxes or to amend the Constitution, they generally have to hold a referendum on that, and the referendum is binding. That's not the case in Britain, and so there's going to be a lot of political turmoil and political intriguing over whether or not we actually will leave and in what manner. Okay,
so that runs contrary to a lot of what we're hearing here in the U.S. In the U.S., I guess maybe people in the mainstream media don't know, and they're just assuming it works like a U.S. referendum, or maybe they do know. I don't know, but the portrayal here is that it's a binding referendum. Do you think the results of the referendum are going to end up being followed, shall we say, or do you think that we're going to see a different outcome?
It's really too soon to tell. But yes, we do seem to get this impression in Britain that everywhere else in the world it's being reported as a US-style referendum, the kind of procedure that you adopted in the progressive era with regard to your states. But it's really an open question whether the politicians will go through with this. You may have heard quite recently, following the referendum, that there were petitions through the British government website about holding a second referendum. So the Remain voters have been notorious, have been sort of so bitter about the result. They're fine with democracy most of the time, but when it goes someone else's way, they're not fine with democracy. So as for whether it will actually go through, it's far too soon to tell, and it depends largely on the results of the Conservative leadership election, which have been triggered by the resignation of the Prime Minister David Cameron. And he'll be gone by September, I understand, and October definitely at the latest. And this resignation and then followed by a leadership election will be decided mostly by the members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, so about 300 Conservative MPs, and then it will eventually be referred to the 150,000 members of the Conservative Party, and then we'll have a new Prime Minister based on those elections. And there are currently 5 candidates standing for the leadership of the Conservative Party who will then become Prime Minister. And they're not brilliant, I have to say. That they leave quite a lot to be desired. The way I would explain it to an American audience would be, let's say the GOP primary field was much narrower than it actually was last year to this year, and let's say you had the choice of Mitt Romney, John McCain, Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich, Chris Christie, maybe Paul Ryan, basically all very similar in their foreign policy and largely from the same sort of political background, and so a lot will depend, quite frankly, on the outcome of this leadership election.
All right, so I want to return to that topic in a little bit, but let's get into the background and the campaign that went along with this referendum. So how did this referendum come about? What was the process that led up to this referendum being held, and then why did they agree to hold this referendum in Westminster? Why did David Cameron and others agree to hold it, or was he even a part of agreeing to hold it?
I understand that the former Foreign Secretary, that is our Secretary of State, William Hague, actually suggested the strategy of holding a referendum on this issue. And I say strategy because that's essentially what it has been. It's really about a political strategy, partly to resolve differences within the Conservative Party itself, and also what I think has been a failed strategy, and will probably prove to be a failed strategy, to increase the popularity of the Conservative Party and try to contain the rise of forces like UKIP within British politics. And so it wasn't some sort of voluntary referendum, if you like, that the Conservative Party didn't want to hold this referendum. You've had politicians like Nigel Farage urging for decades now to hold a referendum on this issue. And they've been gathering more and more force in local elections, in European elections, and even in general elections, as with last year. And they've been a growing electoral force, and they've been exerting pressure on the main parties, and something had to give sooner or later. And so I think in 2013, David Cameron had to finally give in. And it was then that he announced his intention to hold the referendum. And he said he would hold it by 2017, and he said it would come after a renegotiation of Britain's terms of membership of the European Union, and so that's really the context of it. And obviously we had it on Thursday, the 23rd of June, and the result was as I said before.
Yeah, so who participated in this referendum? I guess, though, if you live in England or Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland, you were eligible, and if you live in Gibraltar, you were eligible? Is that what it was?
I think there were actually Commonwealth citizens were allowed to vote in the referendum as well. And I believe Irish citizens can participate in a number of British elections. And I'm not entirely sure, but I have heard that EU citizens in general, if they filled out a few extra forms, would have been able to vote in the referendum. So I'm not entirely sure how broad the participation in terms of the actual voting in the election was, but broader than you'd think.
Okay, yeah, that if it is as you described, that definitely is broader than I thought.
Very broad, yeah.
What precedent is there for this? I guess there was a referendum in Greenland in the 80s. Now, Greenland, of course, wasn't a full-fledged EU member, but they were sort of a member via Denmark's membership. But other than that, is there any precedent for something like this?
I don't know. I don't know about it. Well, obviously, within British politics, we had a referendum in 1975, just 2 years after joining the European Union on the 1st of January 1973. And the result of that referendum was something like 17 million people voting to stay in the European Union by a 2/3 majority, I think. This time we've had over 17 million people, about 17.5 million people voting to leave. And so, similar figures, I suppose, and a slightly narrower vote. In Europe, we've seen referendums we've seen them disregarded. We've seen referendums in France and in Denmark, I think, and that was in 2000 over the 2005 proposed European Constitution, and the European Constitution is essentially that. It's it's essentially a proto-federal constitution. It announces quite proudly and quite overtly that we're building something like a federal state. And this constitution was put to some electorates in Europe, and the electorates rejected it. And so rather than accept defeat, the European project decided to go ahead, in spite of defeat, and simply rename the European Constitution the Lisbon Treaty. And obviously, a treaty is viewed as different to an actual constitution, but it's essentially the same thing when you read it. And they brought that in through the back door, and no one has had a chance to vote on the Lisbon Treaty, even though Gordon Brown, our Prime Minister before David Cameron, did promise as a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. I think David Cameron even promised as a referendum on it some years ago. And so there's a lot of precedent for having referendums and then not paying attention to them, and there's a lot of precedent for not having referendums when they've been promised. But there's no precedent that I can think of for a people voting for independence from the European Union and then it happening. But I suppose we'll just have to set a precedent.
Yes, I suppose that'll be the case. So let's go back to that 1975 referendum for a moment and look at how the United Kingdom came to be a part of the European Union in the first place. How did that happen? Why did that happen? And what is the relationship between the United Kingdom and other EU members and the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union as a whole been like over the years?
Well, from what I've read and from what I can sense, the main arguments that were advanced for us joining what was then known as the Common Market following the European Coal and Steel Community was, well, the main argument was peace. We were dealing with a generation who had lived through the Second World War. A lot of people at the time would have also potentially lived through part of the First World War. And they were very much buying into these new global institutions like the UN and also then like the Common Market. They wanted peace in Europe, and Ted Heath, who was Prime Minister when Britain joined the European Union in 1972, 1973, the main arguments that he advanced were that we need peace in Europe, and you do that by creating a united Europe. A politically united Europe. Many people in the referendum campaign that we've just been through have been talking about how we were lied to, about how it was never discussed as a political union at the time when we joined. Well, I actually dispute that. It was made pretty overt. It was made pretty clear that what we were joining was a political union. It was made clear particularly by the Prime Minister of the day. And so, the European Union and formerly the Common Market have always, to my mind, made it clear that what they were planning was a united Europe, if you will, a United States of Europe. And you can go back further than that, further than 1972, to Winston Churchill, and he often used the phrase, a United States of Europe. And so it's always at its heart been political. I don't for a moment believe that the European Union was ever seriously about trade, and its effects on trade haven't been particularly good for Britain. Even if we don't negotiate some kind of phony trade deal following this referendum, we'll still be in a much better position than we are at the moment when it comes to trade. But going back to 1972 to the present day, Britain's relationship with the European Union has always been less than perfect, and our membership has always been quite controversial, particularly within the Conservative Party of late. But at the very beginning, interestingly, the Conservative Party was a very vocal proponent of the European project. Even Margaret Thatcher, at the very beginning, led if you like, the in campaign of 1975, and she was certainly quite in favour of the European Union for most of her premiership. She signed the Single European Act in 1986, which was one of the major steps along the road to this federal state. And throughout the 1990s, the Conservative administration was very pro-Europe. They signed the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, I think, into British law. And so there's always been, whichever government has been in power, for the most part, they've been pro-Europe, no matter which party. And yet the growth in Euroscepticism has been really due to the rise of third forces, like the BNP, which is a far right political party, but more recently the more respectable party being UKIP, and the growth of UKIP. I would attribute the European Union referendum almost completely to the growth of UKIP and the skill and the passion and the quality of the arguments put forward by people like Nigel Farage, and also to events like the European, like the financial collapse and the euro problems, and also to the refugee crisis. And so the British people have finally just said, we want out, partly because of this long-standing Euroscepticism, but also partly because of recent events.
All right, and you mentioned some in there about trade and whether being in the European Union has been good for British trade or not. Can you explain that a little bit, why it wouldn't be good for them to be in the EU and why it might be better for them to be outside of the EU as from a trade perspective?
Mm-hmm. The simple fact is you don't need to be in a free trade agreement. You don't need any kind of political agreement made by politicians who, let's be honest, don't work in the market like most people. They don't have to trade goods and services. They don't know how things work for the vast majority of people. You don't need these pieces of paper in order to have mutually beneficial trade. And what you find is throughout history that we've had a lot of free trade without these free trade deals. And the most worrying thing about the European Union is that it hasn't been expressly about free markets and free trade. To my mind, it has always been a political project, and you obviously don't need a political union to have free trade. But also, as well, the European Union's single market includes not only free movement of capital and free movement of goods, but also free movement of labour, which has done untold damage to the labour force in Britain and has pushed down wages for workers, and has led to lots of social and religious and ethnic divisions, and these divisions you'll actually find lead to an enlarged and activist state. I mean, if you're a ruling class, you want to divide and conquer, and one of the best ways to do that is to fill a country with people who don't like each other, who aren't likely to integrate, who aren't compatible, and the British state has been doing this partly through the European Union, and so the state feeds off this conflict, and let's be honest. If Britain didn't have any kind of free trade agreement with Europe, we would be able to sign free trade agreements much quicker with other countries like Australia, and there are lots of different options actually, which are surfacing at the moment. There's the European Free Trade Agreement that we could enter into with countries like Liechtenstein and Norway and Iceland. Or there are other models which would be just as good, and so Britain's in a position of unprecedented economic strength, and so we shouldn't start to do Britain down, and so I'm really optimistic, to be perfectly honest, about Britain's ability to do real free trade outside of the European Union.
All right, so returning to the issue of the relationship between the UK and the EU with the UK as an EU member, what authority has the EU had in the UK? What authorities the EU Parliament had? Because the UK, of course, is not a part of the Eurozone and has never been. So it appears to me, anyways, that their relationship might be a little different than that of say, Spain or France. Can you talk about the authority that the EU had in the UK?
Are we talking about judicial authority or
judicial,
EU political?
legislative?
Yeah. Right. Well, there's always been slow creeping movements towards towards the view that the European Union should be the ultimate authority in the land, and we've seen various court rulings in Britain, like the factor tame rulings in the 1990s, which essentially struck down an act of Parliament in favour of European Union legislation, and this was the 1988 Merchant Shipping Act, and that set some kind of precedent, but it wasn't firmly entrenched. It wasn't set in stone yet. But in 2002, there was the Thorburn against City of Sunderland Council ruling, which basically established the European Communities Act of 1972 as what was called at the time a constitutional statute. And so what the judges did in that judgment was they said that you can't leave the European Union impliedly. You can't do it by simply passing new legislation which goes against the European Union. You have to do it in a certain very clear way. And so what we've seen through the court, through the High Court, and now through the Supreme Court are judgments in favour of a more entrenched relationship with the European Union. But even so, we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're being subjugated completely to the European Union against our own politicians' consent. We keep ending up with these pro-European Union governments which have kept us in the European Union against our will, and Parliament, no matter what can be said about the power of the European Union, Parliament has remained sovereign. I think this referendum that we're talking about, pretty much demonstrates that. Parliament passed this act, and we've had this referendum. And so, if Parliament wasn't sovereign, if Parliament wasn't able to determine the future of Britain through legislation, then Parliament wouldn't have been able to do this. And so, really, the relationship between our own politicians and Brussels is a mutually beneficial one. They both conspire with each other, and they work together in order to, make sure that neither of them is completely accountable, and neither of them can be held account. And so the European Union, as Sean Gabb, director of the Libertarian Alliance, says, is essentially a fig leaf. And that's its main flaw. The European Union has some power of its own, but it mainly operates through various European ruling classes who use the European Union as a fig leaf. For instance, if David Cameron wants to pass some very unpopular piece of legislation, and if he knows that this won't be approved of by his own electorate, by his own party, by his own supporters, then what he will do is he'll go to Brussels or to Strasbourg or wherever, and he'll conspire. He'll meet with other European leaders in private and say, "Okay, let's come up with some regulation or directive which will have the desired end." And then he will come back and say, "Oh, there's nothing I can do about it. It's all Brussels." And so that's really the chief evil of the European Union, that it is a device for denying accountability to politicians.
Okay, so who was on who was on each side in the campaign that led up to the referendum, and what did that campaign look like? I guess it got pretty nasty, and you had the politicization of the murder of Joe Cox, a Labour MP. But what did that whole campaign look like?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's exactly as you would expect. Every single trick in the book was used. You'll remember Barack Obama was wheeled out by the Remain side during the campaign when Barack Obama was over here, and the famous line from Barack Obama, which really backfired against the Remain side, was, "If Britain votes to leave the European Union, then Britain will be at the back of the queue when it comes to American free trade deals." The funny thing is, no one really wants to be in these trade deals that America's organising at the moment. TTIP and the transatlantic.
And a lot of Americans don't want to be in them either.
Yeah, exactly. So, threatening us. On the one hand, threatening us just makes us more defiant, but on the other hand, threatening us that we're not going to be in something that's really bad is probably an incentive to do the opposite of what you tell us. And so that you got that. We had international politician after international politician telling us to stay in the European Union. We had international expert after international expert telling us to stay in the European Union. And, Michael Gove, who is currently a contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party, said that people have just had it with experts. The British people are just sick of experts. And, we use the word expert in inverted commas. These people who are usually paid by the institutions that they're advising us to listen to. University students, for instance, have been incredibly supportive of the European Union, and why wouldn't they be when the European Union gives a lot of money to universities? Lots of university professors are in favour of staying in the European Union, and again, why wouldn't they be? We have lots of professors who owe their positions in British universities to the European Union. And so this is, as for who's on both sides, it's been quite refreshing, actually, to see cooperation between the left and the right in British politics. We've seen cooperation between the likes of Nigel Farage, who is seen as a very right-wing figure in British politics, with the likes of George Galloway, who is very left-wing, and at the moment probably not very popular for various reasons. And so we've seen cooperation between the left and the right, but I think George Galloway summed it up quite neatly in February at a speech to what was a brilliant organisation called Grassroots Out, which was really part of this, non-partisan bringing together of lots of different forces against the European Union. And what he said was, Nigel and I agree on hardly anything at all, but we agree on one thing, that Britain should be a sovereign, democratic, independent country, and that if the British people want to elect someone as far left as me, or someone as far left as Nigel, or someone as far right as Nigel, they should be able to do it. And the way that we get to that situation is by leaving the European Union. And we didn't hear nearly enough of that. We didn't hear nearly enough of the sovereignty argument, nearly enough of the secession argument, if you like. It was mainly a campaign which was quite petty and quite statistic dominated. And what I was saying all the way through the referendum is you can make up any statistic you like, and people were increasingly coming to that conclusion, and they were deciding that a lot of these so-called experts are probably lying or probably not very good. But and also when it comes to people, in the referendum itself, it was quite funny to watch the Labour Party squirm throughout the referendum, because the Labour Party since September 2015 has been stuck with a far left socialist leader who is so socialist, so far left, that he hates the European Union. And the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party and the majority of Labour Party MPs are not of that persuasion. They are essentially Blairites or Brownites, essentially centre-left, moderate leftists who believe in social democracy, and they're essentially Hillary Clinton-type figures. And so it was quite amusing to watch these people try to make Jeremy Corbyn campaign to stay in the European Union, and it was blatantly obvious that he didn't want to do this. But he ended up giving a few speeches which were very unenthusiastic for staying in the European Union. And so throughout the referendum campaign, and I predict for the coming months, one legacy of this referendum will be that the British left will be increasingly divided and increasingly stunted. And that's surely a good thing.
So you said that this campaign wasn't about the sovereignty issue as much as maybe it should have been. What were some of the issues that it was about? Was it more about immigration and the refugee crisis? I guess the stability factor from the Remain side was a big issue, and the so-called free trade, managed crony trade, whatever we actually want to call it.
Yeah.
But what were some of the main arguments that were put forth if sovereignty wasn't such a big one?
I was quite dispirited by the extent to which the campaign was really about how much money we send to Europe and how much we get back. And so one of the most widely publicised figures of the referendum, of the referendum campaign, was widely publicised by by UKIP and later on by Vote Leave. And it was that we send £350 million a week to the European Union, and surely we should spend this money on other things like the National Health Service. And on the one hand, they're right, but on the other hand, they're wrong. It was so dispiriting to see the independence movement, the Leave campaign, have to resort to social democracy, have to resort to pledging even more spending for the National Health Service and for other government organisations. But to be perfectly honest, I don't care how much money we send to the European Union. We already have a government national debt of about 1.6 trillion. The national debt has doubled in about 5 years, and so how much do these contributions actually add to the national debt? Surely adding even more to the massive budget for the National Health Service would just add to the national debt even more. And so part of the campaign was really about the government budget and about public services like the NHS and schools and so forth. Part of it was about immigration, and perhaps more of it should have been about immigration, because immigration is a very big issue in Britain. The majority of people definitely did vote to leave the European Union in the belief that it would allow for lower levels of immigration. And whatever you think about immigration, if you're broadly of the opinion that it benefits the economy, or broadly of the opinion that it's just not a good thing in mass quantities, whatever you think, the people have spoken, and it was a major issue. And the Cameron government was elected on the manifesto promise, on the platform of reducing net migration to the tens of thousands a year. And what has actually happened is immigration has risen to its highest levels in British history. to levels of about 500,000 a year. And again, whether you're pro-immigration or broadly of the position that we should control it, this is surely going against the will of the people who voted the government in. And again, people have signalled a protest against mass immigration through this European Union referendum. But of course, when you mention immigration, you talk about immigration, and when a lot of the European Union referendum was about immigration, the slurs of racist and xenophobic and so forth end up being thrown about. And of course, part of this ended up being talked about following the death of Joe Cox towards the end of the campaign. It was said that the man who killed, I don't know one way or the other what motivated this man or what his affiliation was, but I've heard that he was a far right activist of some kind, and therefore the Remain side of the European referendum started to enthusiastically denounce every person who wanted to leave the European Union as a racist and as some kind of fascist. And so, that's the kind of thing that we were encountering in the referendum as well. Another issue would be free trade, but this was really what's known as a valence issue. There are two types of political issue. There are valence issues and there are position issues. A valence issue is one where all the political parties or the main political parties all agree on the desired outcome. And a position issue is one where the two parties are completely diametrically opposed on the outcome and the goal. And so free trade is a valence issue. Everyone in politics, in British politics, and I would say, the vast majority of people believe in free trade. And so it's a valence issue. It's a classic valence issue, as is the economy in general. Everyone wants a better economy, but it's just a matter of how do you go about that. And of course, the Leave campaign was saying we can have a better system of free trade if we're outside the European Union. And the Remain side was saying, no, the European Union is all about free trade. We would have no one to export our goods to if we weren't in the European Union. Which, of course, is nonsense. We have a massive trade deficit with the European Union, and we have a massive surplus with the rest of the world. If we left the European Union, and if the European Union were then to erect massive trade barriers against us, it would do an enormous amount of harm to their economies, to their exporters. And so they're not going to do that. Or if they do that, they'd be fairly stupid to do so. And another issue running through the entire campaign was really about the political class versus the people, or globalism versus a benevolent kind of nationalism, if you like. And so those are the main issues, I would say.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.